Hi, my name is Corrie and I'm reading to you from Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. Today we read out of chapter 11, Ravensbrook. For 2 more incredible days and 2 nights, we were carried deeper and deeper into the land of our fears. Occasionally, one of the loaves of bread was passed from hand to hand, but not even the most elementary provision had been made for sanitation, and the air in the car was such that few could eat. And gradually, more terrible than the crush of bodies and the filth, the single obsession was something to drink. 2 or 3 times when the train stopped, the door was slit open a few inches and a pail of water passed in. But we had become animals, incapable of plan or system. Those near the door got it all. At last, the morning of the 4th day, the train stopped again, and the door was opened its full width. Like infants, on hands and knees, we crawled to the opening and lowered ourselves over the side. In front of us was a smiling blue lake. On the far side, among sycamore trees, rose a white church steeple. The stronger prisoners hauled buckets of water from the lake. We drank through cracked and swollen lips. The train was shorter. The cars carrying the men had disappeared. Only a handful of soldiers, some of them looking no older than 15, were there to guard 1,000 women. No more were needed. We could scarcely walk, let alone resist. After a while, they got us into straggly columns and marched us off. For a mile, the road followed the shore of the lake, then left it to climb a hill. I wondered if Betsy could make it to the top, but the sight of trees and sky seemed to have revived her, and she supported me as much, I her. We passed a number of local people on foot and in horse-drawn wagons. The children especially seemed wonderful to me, pink-cheeked and healthy. They returned my stares with wide-eyed interest. I noticed, however, that the adults did not look at us, but turned their heads away as we approached. From the crest of the hill, we saw it, like a vast scar on the green German landscape, a city of low grey barracks, surrounded by concrete walls on which guard towers rose at intervals. In the very centre, a square smokestack emitted a thin grey vapour into the blue sky. Ravensbrook. Like a whispered curse, the word passed back through the lines. This was the notorious women's extermination camp, whose name we had heard, even in Haarlem. The squat concrete building, that smoke disappearing in the bright sunlight. No, I would not look at it. As Betsy and I stumbled down the hill, I felt the Bible bumping between my shoulder blades. God's good news. Was it to this world that He had spoken it? Now we were close enough to see the skull and crossbones posted at intervals on the walls to warn off electrified wiring along the top. The massive iron gate swung in, We marched between them. Acres of soot grey barracks stretched ahead of us. Just inside the wall was a row of waist-high water spigots. We charged them, thrusting hands, arms, legs, even heads under the streams of water, washing away the stench of the boxcars. A squad of women guards in dark blue uniforms rushed at us, hauling and shouting, swinging their short, hard crops. At last, they drove us back from the faucets and herded us down on an avenue between barracks. This camp appeared far grimmer than the one we had left. At least, in marches about Vught, we had caught sight of fields and woods. Here, every vista ended in the same concrete barrier. The camp was set down in a vast man-made valley, rising on every side to those towering wire-topped walls. At last we halted. In front of us, a vast canvas tent roof. No sides, covered an acre or more of straw-strewn ground. Betty and I found a spot on the edge of this area and sank gratefully down. Instantly, we were on our feet again. Lice! The straw was literally alive with them. We stood for a while, clutching blankets and pillowcases well away from the infested ground. But at last, we spread our blankets over the squirming straw and sat on them. Some of the prisoners had brought scissors from Vught. Everywhere beneath the huge tent, women were cutting one another's hair. A pear was passed to us. Of course, we must do the same. Long hair was folly in such a place. But as I cut Betsy's chestnut waves, I cried. Toward evening, there was a commotion at one end of the tent. A line of SS guards was moving across it, driving women out from under the canvas. We scrambled to our feet and snatched up our blankets as they bore down upon us. Perhaps 100 yards beyond the tent, the chase had stopped. We stood about, uncertain what to do, whether a new group of prisoners had arrived, or what the reason was for driving us from the tent. No one knew. Women began spreading their blankets on the hard sundered ground. Slowly it dawned on Betsy and me that we were to spend the night here where we stood. We laid my blanket on the ground, stretched out side by side, and pulled hers over us. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Betsy's sweet soprano was picked up by voices all around us. Lead thou me on. We were waked up sometime in the middle of the night by a clap of thunder and a deluge of rain. The blankets soaked through, and water gathered in puddles beneath us. In the morning, the field was a vast, sodden swamp. Hands, clothes, and faces were black from cinder mud. We were still wringing water from our blankets when the command came to line up for coffee. It was not coffee, but a thin liquid of approximately the same color, and we were grateful to get it as we shuffled double file past the makeshift field kitchen. There was a slice of black bread for each prisoner too. Then nothing more until We were given a ladle of turnip soup and a small boiled potato late in the afternoon. In between, we were kept standing at rigid attention on the soggy parade ground where we had spent the night. We were near one edge of the huge camp here, close enough to the outer wall to see the triple row of electric wires running along the top. 2 entire days we spent this way, stretching out again the second night right where we stood. It did not rain again, but ground and blankets were still damp. Betsy began to cough. I took Nolly's blue sweater from my pillowcase, wrapped it around her, and gave her a few drops of the vitamin oil. But by morning, she had antagonizing intestinal cramps. Again and again, throughout that second day, she had to ask the impatient woman monitor at the head of our row for permission to go to the ditch that served as sanitary facility. It was the third night, as we were getting ready to lie down again under the sky, when the order came to report to the processing center for new arrivals. A 10-minute march brought us to the building. We inched along a corridor into a huge reception room, and there, under the harsh ceiling lights, we saw a dismal sight. As each woman reached a desk where some officers sat, she had to lay her blanket, pillowcase, and whatever else she carried onto a growing pile of these things. A few desks further along, she had to strip off every scrap of clothes, throw them into a second pile, and walk naked past the scrutiny of a dozen SS men into the shower room. Coming out of the shower, she wore only a thin prison dress and a pair of shoes. Nothing more. But Betsy needed that sweater. She needed the vitamins. Most of all, we needed our Bible. How could we live in this place without it? But how could I ever take it past so many watchful eyes without the overalls covering it? We were almost at the first desk. I fished desperately in my pillowcase, drew out the bottle of vitamins, and closed my fist around them. Reluctantly, we dropped the other things on the heap that was fast becoming a mountain. Dear God, I prayed, you have given us this precious book. You have kept it hidden through checkpoints and inspections. You have used it for so many. I felt Betsy staggered against me and looked at her in alarm. Her face was white, her lips pressed tight together. A guard was passing by. I begged him in German to show us the toilets. Without so much as a glance, he jerked his head in the direction of the shower room. Timidly, Betsy and I stepped out of line and walked to the door of the big, dank-smelling room with its row on row of overhead spigots. It was empty, waiting for the next batch of 50 naked and shivering women to be admitted. Please, I said to the SS man guarding the door, where are the toilets? He did not look at me either. Use the drain holes, he snapped. And as we stepped inside, he slammed the door behind us. we stood alone in the room where a few minutes later we would return, stripped even of the clothes on our backs. Here were the prison things we were to put on, piled just inside the door. From the front and back of each other ordinary dress, a large X had been cut out and replaced with cloth of another color. And then we saw something else, stacked in the far corner, a pile of wooden benches. They were slimy with mildew, crawling with cockroaches, but to me they seemed the furniture of heaven itself. "The sweater! Take the sweater off!" I hissed, fumbling with the string at my neck. Betsy handed it to me, and in an instant I had wrapped it around the Bible and the vitamin bottle and stuffed the precious bundle behind the benches. And so it was that when we were herded into that room 10 minutes later, we were not poor, but rich. Rich in this new evidence of the care of Him who was God, even of Ravensbrook. We stood beneath the spigots as long as the flow of icy water lasted, feeling it soften our lice-eaten skin. Then we clustered dripping wet around the heap of prison dresses, holding them up, passing them about, looking for approximate fits. I found a loose long-sleeve dress for Betsy that would cover the blue sweater when she would have a chance to put it on. I squirmed into another dress for myself, then reached behind the benches and shoved the little bundle quickly inside the neck. It made a bulge you could have seen across the Grote Markt. I flattened it out as best I could, pushing it down, tugging the sweater around my waist, but there was no real concealing it beneath the thin cotton dress. And all the while, I had the incredible feeling that it didn't matter, that this was not my business, but God's. That all I had to do was walk straight ahead. As we trooped back through the showered room door, the SS men ran their hands over every prisoner, from back and sides. The woman ahead of me was searched 3 times. Behind me, Betsy was searched. No hand touched me. At the exit door to the building was a second ordeal, a line of women guards examining each prisoner again. I slowed down as I reached them, but the Aufseherin in charge shoved me roughly by the shoulder. "Move along! You're holding up the line!" And so Betsy and I arrived in Barracks 8 in the small hours of that morning, bringing not only the Bible, but a new knowledge of the power of Him whose story it was. There were 3 women already asleep in the bed assigned to us. They made room for us as best they could, but the mattress sloped and I kept sliding to the floor. At last, all 5 of us lay sideways across the bed and managed to get shoulders and elbows arranged. The blanket was a poor threadbare affair compared with the ones we had given up, but at least the overcrowding produced its own warmth. Betsy had put on the blue sweater beneath her long-sleeved dress, and wedged now between me and the others, her shivering gradually subsided, and she was asleep. I lay awake a while longer, watching a searchlight sweep the rear wall in long, regular arcs. hearing the distant calls of soldiers patrolling the walls. Morning call at Ravensbrück came half an hour earlier than Vught. By 4:30 a.m., we had to be standing outside in the black pre-dawn chill, standing at parade attention in blocks of 100 women, 10 wide, 10 deep. Sometimes, after hours of this, we would gain the shelter of the barracks, only to hear the whistle. Everybody out! Falling for roll call! Barracks 8 was in the quarantine compound. Next to us, perhaps as a deliberate warning to newcomers, were located the punishment barracks. From there, all day long and often into the night, came the sounds of hell itself. They were not the sounds of anger or of any human emotion, but of a cruelty altogether detached. Blows landing in regular rhythm, screams keeping pace. We would stand in our 10 deep ranks with our hands trembling at our sides, longing to jam them against our ears to make the sounds stop. The instant of dismissal, we would mob the door of Barracks 8, stepping on each other's heels in our eagerness to get inside, to shrink the world back to understandable proportions. It grew harder and harder. Even within these four walls, there was too much misery, too much seemingly pointless suffering. Every day something else failed to make sense. Something else grew too heavy. Will you carry this too, Lord Jesus? But as the rest of the world grew stranger, one thing became increasingly clear. And that was the reason the two of us were here. Why others should suffer, we were not shown. As for us, from morning until lights out, whenever we were not in ranks for roll call, our Bible was the center of an ever-widening circle of help and hope. Like waves clustered around a blazing fire, we gathered about it, holding out our hearts to its warmth and light. The blacker the night around us grew, the brighter and truer and more beautiful burned the word of God. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. I would look about as Betty read, watching the light leap from face to face. More than conquerors. It was not a wish, it was a fact. We knew it, we experienced it minute by minute, poor, hated, hungry. We were more than conquerors, not we shall be, we are. Life in Ravensbrück took place on two separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable external life grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better, truth upon truth, glory upon glory. Sometimes I would slip the Bible from its little sack with hands that shook, so mysterious had it become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marveled sometimes that the ink was dry. I had believed the Bible always, but reading it now had nothing to do with belief. It was simply a description of the way things went, of hell and heaven, of how men act and how God acts. I had read 1,000 times the story of Jesus' arrest, how soldiers had slapped him, laughed at him, flogged him. Now, such happenings had faces and voices. Fridays, the recurrent humiliation of medical inspection. The hospital corridor in which we waited was unheated, and the fall chill had settled into the walls. Still, we were forbidden even to wrap ourselves in our own arms, but had to maintain our erect, hands at sides position as we filed slowly past a phalanx of grinning guards. How there could have been any pleasure in the sight of these stick-thin legs and hunger-bloated stomachs, I could not imagine. Surely there is no more wretched sight than the human body unloved and uncared for. Nor could I see the necessity for the complete undressing. When we finally reached the examining room, a doctor looked down each throat, another, a dentist presumably, at our teeth, a third in between each finger. And that was all. We trooped again down the long, cold corridor and picked up our X-marked dresses at the door. But it was one of these mornings while we were waiting, shivering in the corridor, that yet another page in the Bible leaped into life for me. He hung naked on the cross. I had not known. I had not thought. The paintings, the carved crucifixes, showed at least a scrap of cloth. But this, I suddenly knew, was the respect and reverence of the artist. But oh, at the time itself, and on that other Friday morning, there had been no reverence, no more than I saw in the faces around us now. I leaned toward Betsy, ahead of me in line. Her shoulder blades stood out sharp and thin beneath her blue mottled skin. Betsy, they took his clothes too. Ahead of me I heard a little gasp. Oh, Corrie, and I never thanked him. Every day the sun rose a little later. The bite took longer to leave the air. It will be better, everyone assured everyone else, when we move into permanent barracks. We'll have a blanket apiece, a bed of our own. Each of us painted into the picture her own greatest need. For me, it was a dispensary where Betsy could get medication for her cough. There'll be a nurse assigned to the barracks. I said it so often that I convinced myself. I was doling out a drop of the day vitamin each morning on her piece of black bread. But how much longer could the small bottle last? Especially, I would tell her, if you keep sharing it around every time someone sneezes. The move to permanent quarters came the second week in October. We were marched 10 abreast along a wide cinder avenue and then into a narrow street of barracks. Several times the column halted while numbers were read out. Names were never used at Ravensbrück. At last, Betsy's and mine were called. Prisoner 66729, prisoner 66730. We stepped out of line with a dozen or so others and stared at the long grey front of Barracks 28. Half its windows seemed to have been broken and replaced with rags. A door in the centre led us into a large room where 200 or more women bent over knitting needles. On tables between them were piles of woolen socks in army grey. On either side, doors opened into two still larger rooms, by far the largest dormitories we had yet seen. Betsy and I followed a prisoner guide through the door at the right. Because of the broken windows, the vast room was in semi-twilight. Our noses told us first that the place was filthy. Somewhere plumbing had backed up. The bedding was soiled and rancid. Then, as our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw that there were no individual beds at all, but great square piers stacked 3 high and wedged side by side and end to end with only an occasional narrow aisle slicing through. We followed our guide single file. The aisle was not wide enough for two, fighting back the claustrophobia of these platforms rising everywhere above us. The tremendous room was nearly empty of people. They must have been out on various work crews. At last, she pointed to a second tier in the center of a large block. To reach it, we had to stand on the bottom level, haul ourselves up, and then crawl across 3 other straw-covered platforms to reach the one that we would share with how many? The deck above us was too close to let us sit up. We lay back, struggling against the nausea that swept over us from the reeking straw. We could hear the women who had arrived with us finding their places. And tomorrow we will continue with chapter 13, Ravensbrück. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.